Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of precision. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Right. The timeline of cause and effect is visible, it's neatly categorized, but the medical field relies on distinct categories and immediate evidence, and early colonial history offers no such comfort.
Yeah, we are looking at a historical landscape today that is fundamentally murky. We are dealing with a time when intentions, alliances, and the very concept of human survival were shifting rapidly under the feet of everyone involved.
We really are. Today, we are wading straight into those historical muddy waters. We are looking at New England in the 1630s.
And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the Pequot War, which raged from 1636 to 1638. This was the first sustained and truly devastating conflict between European colonists and indigenous peoples in the northeast of North America.
I'd say understanding this conflict is the key to understanding how the foundational dynamics of the Americas were forged. The fragile balance of power, the intricate webs of diplomacy, the ruthless nature of the early global trade economy.
And the sheer raw instincts of survival, right? Because all of that collided in a very short window of time.
Spot on. So for you listening, keep the idea of unintended consequences in the front of your mind. Every single action we are going to explore today triggered a reaction that nobody could have fully anticipated.
To make sense of the violence, we have to understand the specific environment where this all ignited. We are heading to the Connecticut River Valley.
The Connecticut River Valley in the 1630s was one of the most lucrative yet highly volatile regions on the continent. The natural geography of the region created an intense economic funnel.
Because the river itself was a superhighway for transportation, right?
Yes, and the surrounding floodplains offered some of the most fertile agricultural soil in the Northeast. That natural wealth made the valley a target for multiple competing factions.
I'm looking at this like a high-stakes geopolitical chessboard. You have the Dutch, the English, the Pequots, the Mohegans, and the Narragansetts all converging on the same finite resources.
That is a great way to frame it. But before we even get to the European arrivals, we really need to understand the indigenous political landscape. Who actually held the power in the valley before the 1630s?
Right, because the Pequot and the Mohegan people were originally a single, dominant socio-political entity, weren't they?
They were. They were a powerful Algonquian group controlling the region. But to understand their power, we have to look at the mechanics of their leadership. Indigenous power structures were not like European monarchies.
So, a leader, known as a sachem, didn't rule by divine right or absolute decree.
No, not at all. A sachem held power through consensus, diplomacy, resource distribution, and military success. The people had to willingly follow them. Under the leadership of a highly effective grand sachem named Taitobem, this unified group had aggressively extended their area of control.
They dominated neighboring tribes, so the groups like the Connecticut River Valley Algonquian nations and the Lenape people of Long Island. But then that unity fractured.
It did. In 1633, Taitobem died. His death precipitated a severe succession crisis. The leadership was hotly contested. Uncas, who was a prominent leader and a direct descendant of the tribal lineage, expected to ascend to the position.
But he was passed over, right?
Instead he was passed over.
I imagine that slight did not sit well with Uncas.
You would be correct. Uncas and his followers made a profound political decision. They chose to secede. They established themselves as a distinct and separate tribe, taking the name Mohegan.
Oh, I see. So the Mohegans are born out of this specific political schism.
Yes, and under Uncas's leadership, the Mohegans moved west of the Thames River. Meanwhile, the majority of the people remained to the east, retaining the name Pequot, and they were led by the new Grand Sachem, Sassacus.
So we immediately have a divided house. We have the Pequots under Sassacus to the east, and the newly formed Mohegans under Uncas to the west.
And this internal division happens right as the external economic pressures are reaching a boiling point.
Which brings us to the actual engine driving all this regional tension. What was the primary economic force here?
The primary engines were the wampum trade and the fur trade. By subjugating the neighboring coastal tribes, the Pequots had effectively monopolized the production and flow of wampum.
Wait, I need to stop you there. I am stuck on the economics. I understand that wampum are beads made from clam and conch shells.
Yeah.
I know they were highly valued as a diplomatic tool and a record-keeping device.
Right.
But why did European powers, specifically the Dutch, who have global maritime trade routes, care so deeply about local shell beads? I mean, why couldn't the Dutch just bypass the Pequots entirely?
Well, the Dutch were not interested in the shells for themselves. They needed the shells to get beaver pelts. The Dutch West India Company had established a fortified trading post in the region, the House of Good Hope.
So they wanted furs to send back to the lucrative markets in Europe.
Yes, but the primary source of those high-quality beaver pelts was further inland, controlled by powerful groups like the Iroquois Confederacy.
And the inland tribes wanted wampum.
Precisely. The inland tribes highly valued wampum for ceremonial and political purposes, but they did not live on the coast to harvest the shells. The Dutch realized that if they acquired wampum from the coastal tribes, they could use it as a proxy currency to buy furs from the inland tribes.
Oh, okay. And the Pequots understood this dynamic perfectly, didn't they?
They absolutely did. By controlling the coastal tribes that manufactured the wampum, the Pequots positioned themselves as the unavoidable middlemen. The Dutch had to go through Sassacus to get the wampum they needed to fund their fur empire.
That is a brilliant economic stranglehold. But then the English Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Pilgrims from Plymouth Colony start pushing south and west.
Right, in the early 1630s, they began building permanent river towns. You have Windsor in 1632, Wethersfield in 1633, Hartford in 1635.
How do the smaller, subjugated tribes in the valley view these heavily armed English rivals?
The smaller tribes viewed the English as a crucial geopolitical opportunity. A tribe paying heavy tribute to the Pequots saw a chance to align with the English to overthrow that dominance.
So the English presented a new, alternative trade partner and a military counterweight to Sassacus.
That is right. The chessboard is incredibly crowded and tense now. The Dutch and the Pequots have their arrangement. The Mohegans are looking to elevate their status against their former Pequot brethren.
And the Narragansetts to the east are historic rivals of the Pequots. Add to that the English building permanent settlements to bypass the Dutch and get directly to the furs.
But you know, human politics are only half the story here. Nature threw a devastating variable into this delicate equilibrium.
Right, the environment turns on them.
In late August of 1635, the Great Colonial Hurricane swept across New England. Meteorological estimates suggest it was a Category 3 or Category 4 storm.
That is intense.
It brought sustained winds over 130 miles per hour and a storm surge that reportedly reached 20 feet in some coastal areas.
A 20-foot wall of water hitting a landscape of early colonial settlements and coastal indigenous villages, I mean, that is catastrophic.
The environmental destruction was absolute. The winds flattened entire forests, making navigation and hunting nearly impossible. More importantly, the storm hit right before the harvest.
So it completely wiped out the corn crops.
Yes, the result was a severe period of regional food scarcity. Both the European colonists and the indigenous populations faced immediate starvation. Historical accounts describe the following winter as a time of profound dearth and desperation.
Hunger changes the entire psychological landscape.
Yeah.
When people are starving, diplomacy becomes exponentially
It
harder.
really does.
If you are struggling to feed your family through the winter, your tolerance for trade disputes or territorial encroachment drops to zero. Desperation breeds paranoia.
Starvation forced every faction to guard their remaining resources fiercely. The English colonists were ill-prepared to survive a winter without their crops, and the indigenous groups saw their winter food stores washed away.
So the baseline of existence in the valley shifted from economic competition to raw survival. And into this incredibly paranoid, starving environment sails a man practically designed to cause an explosion.
Yes, let us look at the first spark of the conflict. The year is 1634. An English trader named John Stone is killed by the Western Nyantics, who were tributaries to the Pequots.
But Stone was not just an innocent merchant, was he?
No, not at all. John Stone had a notorious reputation across the colonies. He was originally from the West Indies and had been officially banished from Boston for a litany of severe malfeasance.
He was a known privateer, essentially a pirate.
Yes. The charges against him in Massachusetts included drunkenness, adultery, and even pointing a loaded weapon at the governor.
So he was a violent, erratic outcast. What was he doing on the Connecticut River?
Stone was looking for profit wherever he could extract it. During his voyage, he anchored his ship and forcibly abducted 2 Western Nyantic men. He intended to use them as captive navigators to guide his vessel further up the river.
I mean, you cannot just abduct members of a sovereign nation without expecting a severe response.
Exactly what you'd think. Shortly after the abduction, a larger group of Western Nyantic warriors boarded the ship. They killed John Stone and his entire crew of 7 men.
But wait, if Boston had already banished Stone for being a drunken pirate, why did the colonial officials care that he was dead? Did they certainly feel a deep kinship with him?
The colonial officials felt absolutely no personal sorrow for John Stone. Some contemporary accounts suggest they were privately relieved he was gone.
Oh, that makes sense.
However, as representatives of the English crown, they felt politically compelled to protest the killing of an Englishman by indigenous people, regardless of that Englishman's character.
Because allowing the deaths to go unanswered would, in their view, project weakness.
Right on the mark. They demanded the Pequot Grand Sachem, Sassacus, turn over the warriors responsible for the attack.
How did Sassacus respond to a foreign power demanding his subjects?
Sassacus sent a large quantity of wampum to Boston to atone for the deaths, which was the standard indigenous diplomatic protocol for resolving homicides. But he flatly refused to hand over his men to the English justice system.
And the Pequots and Niantics also provided a critical piece of context for the attack on Stone's ship, right? They claimed it was a case of mistaken identity intertwined with a recent trauma.
Yes. A short time prior to Stone's arrival, the Dutch had abducted the previous Pequot Grand Sachem, Todobem.
The same Todobem who unified the valley.
Yes. The Pequots negotiated in good faith, paying a heavy ransom in wampum to secure their leader's release. The Dutch accepted the ransom, but instead of returning Todobem alive, they handed over his dead body.
That level of betrayal would shatter any trust in European maritime traders.
The Niantics claimed they mistook John Stone's vessel for a Dutch ship. In their view, they were retaliating against the people who had murdered their Grand Sachem.
Okay, so Boston takes the wampum, but the tension over Stone's death simmers for 2 years. Then, in July 1636, the second spark hits. Another English trader, John Oldham, is killed near Block Island.
And John Oldham shared a similar profile with John Stone. Oldham was a highly controversial figure who had been exiled from Plymouth Colony years earlier for sedition and causing internal unrest.
So another troublemaker.
Yes, he was attacked on his trading vessel off the coast of Block Island. He and several crew members were killed, and the ship was looted.
Who actually carried out the attack on Oldham?
The attack was executed by Native Americans allied with the Narragansetts. Their political goal was likely to disrupt trade and discourage the English from establishing commercial ties with their Pequot rivals.
However, after the murder, the perpetrators managed to escape Block Island and were granted sanctuary by the Pequots.
Correct. So the Pequots are now harboring the men who killed a second English trader. Massachusetts Bay Colony has their legal pretext.
How do they deploy their military in response?
The governor of Massachusetts Bay, Henry Vane, decides to enact a punitive expedition. He commissions a Puritan military commander named John Endicott to lead a force of 90 heavily armed militiamen to Block Island.
Sending 90 soldiers is not a diplomatic mission. I mean, that is a full-scale military invasion designed to inflict terror.
Endicott's orders were explicit: enact revenge. When the English force landed on Block Island, the indigenous inhabitants, seeing the heavy numerical and technological disadvantage, mostly fled into the dense interior of the island.
They avoided open combat.
Right. Frustrated by the lack of direct combat, the English militia resorted to economic and environmental warfare.
They targeted the infrastructure.
They systematically burned the villages to the ground. But their most devastating tactical decision was to destroy the winter food supplies. They carried away whatever harvested corn they could fit on their ships and burned the rest.
We have to remember the context of the 1635 hurricane. Destroying a community's winter food supply during an ongoing period of regional famine is effectively a death sentence for the entire population. That includes the elderly and children.
It was ruthless. Endicott achieved his destruction on Block Island and then set sail for the mainland. He directed his forces to the mouth of the Connecticut River, intending to move against the Pequots next. He anchored at the English fort at Saybrook.
And the fort at Saybrook brings us to one of the most compelling voices in this history, Lyon Gardner. We really need to understand who Gardner was to understand why Endicott's arrival was so problematic.
Lyon Gardner was a highly experienced English military engineer. He was not a religious colonist. He was a professional soldier who had spent years serving in the brutal wars in the Netherlands, working for the Prince of Orange.
So he was an expert in fortifications and siege warfare.
Yes. The English colonial company hired him specifically to build and command Fort Saybrook to secure the river mouth against Dutch incursions.
Gardner knows the grim reality of warfare. How does he react when Endicott shows up with 90 militiamen, fresh from burning food supplies on Block Island?
Gardner is appalled. He immediately grasps the tactical disaster unfolding. Gardner commands a tiny garrison of 24 people, a mix of soldiers, women, and children.
And they are already struggling with the regional food scarcity.
Precisely. Gardner looks at Endicott's aggressive force and realizes that the politicians in Boston are starting a war that the tiny outpost at Saybrook will have to bleed for.
Gardner documented his intense frustration, and his words paint a terrifying picture of the situation.
He bluntly confronted the Massachusetts commanders. He told them, "You come hither to raise these wasps about my ears, and then you will take wing and flee away."
That metaphor is chilling. Hitting a wasp nest with a stick and running away, leaving the person standing right next to it to suffer the stings.
It is a very vivid image.
It really forces us to question the true motivations of the colonial officials in Boston. Were they truly so outraged by the deaths of Stone and Oldham, two men they had actively banished, or were they just looking for a convenient excuse to project military power and violently seize control of the lucrative wampum and fur trade networks in the valley?
Well, the historical evidence heavily points toward a calculated pretext. The Massachusetts Bay Colony saw the strategic and economic value of the Connecticut River. They recognized that the Pequot Nation was the primary obstacle to their total dominance of the region.
So the deaths of two exiled troublemakers provided the moral and legal cover necessary to launch a war of conquest.
That is right. And Endicott proceeds to hit the wasp nest exactly as Gardner feared. He sails down the coast, demands the Pequots hand over the murderers, and demands a vast tribute of wampum.
When the Pequots hesitate, Endicott attacks.
He burns their villages, destroys more food supplies, kills a few individuals, and then, fulfilling Gardner's dark prophecy, Endicott and his troops get back on their boats and sail away to the safety of Boston.
They just left Lion Gardner and his 24 people at Fort Saybrook entirely alone to face the wrath of the most powerful indigenous nation in the region.
They did. Endicott's hit-and-run tactics forced the Pequots into a corner. They could not just absorb the destruction of their winter food supplies during a famine. They had to retaliate, and they targeted the only English presence within their reach.
Through the autumn of 1636 and the brutal winter of 1637, the Pequots essentially laid siege to Fort Saybrook.
They surrounded the palisade. Anyone who ventured outside the wooden walls to farm, hunt, or gather firewood was immediately attacked.
The psychological toll of that siege must have been profound. 24 people trapped in a freezing, starving wooden fort, completely cut off from the world, surrounded by highly skilled warriors seeking revenge.
But the Pequot leadership knew that a siege on a single fort would not win a wider war against the English colonies. They needed to build a coalition.
Because Sassacus recognized the existential nature of the threat.
He did. He initiated an intense diplomatic campaign. He reached out to the Western Nyantics, the Wengunks, and most notably, his historic rivals, the Narragansetts.
Sending diplomats to the Narragansetts shows how desperate the situation was. He was trying to convince his enemies that the English were a mutual threat.
Sassacus presented a sophisticated, highly accurate geopolitical argument. He warned the Narragansetts that if they helped the English destroy the Pequots, they would only be paving the way for their own inevitable destruction.
He was trying to get them to see the long game.
Yes. He proposed a joint strategy of asymmetric guerrilla warfare. He told the Narragansetts they should not face the English muskets in open battle. Instead, they should burn the English houses, kill their cattle, and ambush the colonists as they worked in the fields.
Sassacus argued that without the ability to farm or trade safely, the English would eventually starve and abandon the continent.
Which is a brilliant articulation of asymmetric warfare. It targets the economic and agricultural vulnerability of the enemy rather than their military strength.
So why did the Narragansetts refuse the alliance?
The Narragansetts weighed the immediate threat against the future threat. They were currently more threatened by the military power of the Pequots than they were by the English.
Furthermore, the English deployed their own diplomats, didn't they?
Yes. Roger Williams, a colonial leader who had spent years building strong relationships and linguistic fluency with the Narragansetts, personally intervened to secure their alliance for the English.
I see.
The Narragansetts, along with Uncas and his Mohegans, calculated that siding with the English was the safest route to securing their own regional power.
So Sassacus fails to recruit the Narragansetts, forcing a localized strategy. But he does secure the help of the Wengunks.
He does.
And the involvement of the Wengunks brings us to the settlement of Wethersfield, which provides a striking example of how poor colonial diplomacy created desperate enemies.
Wethersfield was the southernmost of the new English river towns. It was established directly on land belonging to the Wengunk tribe.
The leader of the Wangunks was a sachem named Sowage. When the English first arrived to scout the territory, how did Sowage react?
Well, Sowhedge actively welcomed the English. He encouraged them to settle on his land.
Why would an indigenous leader invite an armed foreign power to build a town in his territory?
Sowage was making a pragmatic geopolitical calculation. The Wangunks were heavily subjugated by the Pequots and forced to pay tribute. Sowhedge believed that an alliance with the heavily armed English would provide a crucial military shield against Pequot domination.
He invited them in as protectors and trade partners.
Mhm.
But the English colonists did not behave like grateful guests.
The colonial expansion was relentless. Soon after the English families established their town, they began aggressive agricultural encroachment, pushing Sowage and his people off the most fertile floodplains.
And crucially, the English exploited a recent tragedy. Between 1633 and 1634, a devastating smallpox epidemic swept through the indigenous populations of the valley.
The mortality rates from those virgin soil epidemics were horrific, sometimes reaching up to 90% in a single village. The Wangunks were severely weakened by the disease.
The English colonists recognized this demographic collapse and used it to effectively force Sowage and his remaining people out of their own home, displacing them to another village further away.
The tragic irony is profound. Sowage uses diplomacy to invite an ally to protect his people, and that ally immediately betrays him, exploits the devastation of a plague, and steals his agricultural heartland.
By treating a willing partner with such ruthlessness, the colonists turned Sowage into a desperate enemy.
Driven from his ancestral home by the very people he had welcomed, Sowage completely reversed his political alignment. He allied with his former enemies, the Pequots, to enact revenge on the English settlement at Wethersfield.
That revenge materialized on the morning of April 23, 1637.
A joint force of approximately 200 Wangunk and Pequot warriors launched a highly coordinated surprise attack on Wethersfield. They utilized the terrain perfectly, waiting until the colonists were spread out and vulnerable while working in the spring fields.
We need to break down what a coordinated attack looked like in 1637. They were not just charging blindly.
No, the warriors used the tree lines and the riverbanks for concealment. They struck quickly, utilizing traditional weapons like bows, clubs, and stone-tipped spears.
Wethersfield is a small settlement, and the sudden violence overwhelmed the colonists working outside the protective walls of their homes.
The warriors killed 6 men and 3 women. They also systematically destroyed English property, killing cattle and horses to cripple the town's agricultural capacity.
The loss of life and livestock was severe, but the attackers took an action that fundamentally altered the psychological stakes for the English. They took 2 young English girls captive.
The girls were the daughters of William Swain, one of the most prominent men in the settlement. Now, we must view this through the lens of indigenous warfare practices.
Right, the Morning Wars.
Yes. The taking of captives, often referred to as mourning wars, was a standard and highly ritualized practice. Captives were taken to be held for ransom, to be adopted into the tribe, to replace members lost to disease or war, or to be used as diplomatic leverage.
But the English colonists did not understand or care about the cultural nuances of morning wars. To them, the abduction of 2 young girls was an unimaginable escalation. The Wethersfield raid was the definitive tipping point.
The colonial leadership could no longer frame the violence as a localized trade dispute or a retaliatory skirmish. On May 1st, 1637, the General Court of the Connecticut Colony convened in Hartford.
They officially declared an offensive war against the Pequot Nation.
They legally mandated the raising of a militia from the 3 river towns to strike directly at the heart of Pequot territory.
The man chosen to command this newly formed Connecticut militia was Captain John Mason. Who was Mason and what kind of force was he leading?
John Mason, much like Lyon Gardner, had gained his military experience fighting in the brutally sectarian wars of the Netherlands. He was a tough, uncompromising Puritan commander who viewed conflict through a lens of divine providence.
And the Connecticut towns managed to muster a force of 90 English militiamen, but they were not marching into Pequot territory alone.
They were joined by Uncas and 70 Mohegan warriors. This dynamic is vital to understand. The Pequot War was not simply a binary conflict of Europeans versus indigenous people.
It was a complex, multi-factional regional war where indigenous nations utilized the English military apparatus to settle their own political scores and violently shift the balance of power in the valley.
Well said. Mason and his combined force sailed down the river to Fort Saybrook, where Lyon Gardner has survived the grueling winter siege. They are also joined by another English commander, Captain John Underhill, who brings 20 more men from the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
So what happens when these civilian militias meet the professional soldier, Lyon Gardner?
Lyon Gardner immediately takes control of the logistical reality. He is highly skeptical of the quality and discipline of Mason's hastily assembled civilian militia.
He doesn't trust them to hold the line.
Right. Gardner institutes rigorous military vetting. He inspects Mason's 90 men from Hartford and Wethersfield, evaluating their physical fitness, their weaponry, and their psychological readiness for a grueling campaign in hostile territory.
Gardner is not impressed by the Puritan fervor. He wants men who can actually fight.
Gardner actually removes 20 of Mason's men from the ranks. He officially deems them insufficient, judging them physically unfit or too poorly equipped to survive the impending brutality. He dismisses them on the spot and sends them back home on a small boat.
He just fires 20% of the militia. That is incredible.
He needed professionals.
Yeah.
Gardner replaces those 20 dismissed civilians with 20 of his own battle-hardened soldiers from the Fort Saybrook garrison.
Gardner was also deeply suspicious of the Mohegan allies, wasn't he?
He was. Gardner did not trust Uncas. He feared the Mohegans might betray the English once they entered Pequot territory. Gardner demanded a brutal test of loyalty.
What kind of test?
He ordered Uncas to take his warriors out, locate a group of Pequots who had been harassing the fort, and bring back proof of their commitment to the English cause. Uncas's warriors left the fort, engaged a small group of Pequots, killed several, and returned to Saybrook with a Pequot prisoner.
And this violent demonstration satisfied Gardner's tactical paranoia.
It did. Mason now commands a vetted, hardened force. You have English soldiers, Puritan militia, and Mohegan warriors. His official orders from the Connecticut General Court are to sail directly to the Pequot territory and launch a frontal assault on the main Pequot fort.
But Mason decides to completely disobey those direct orders.
The Pequots possess two heavily fortified villages near the coast, Wineshocks, where Sassacus resided, and Mystic. The Pequot scouts were watching the coastline, expecting the English ships to land at the mouth of the Thames River and initiate a direct frontal attack.
And Mason realized that a direct assault against a prepared, fortified enemy would be a tactical disaster. So he employs a strategy of grand deception.
Mason orders his ships to sail right past the Pequot territory. The Pequot scouts watching from the shore saw the English vessels sail away to the east, heading toward Narragansett Bay.
The Pequots concluded that the English had lost their nerve and were fleeing the region.
Believing the imminent threat was over, the Pequots began to celebrate.
But Mason was not fleeing. He lands his forces deep in Narragansett territory. He meets with the Narragansett leadership and secures the backing of 200 more Narragansett warriors.
Mason now commands a joint force of roughly 77 English soldiers and nearly 300 Mohegan and Narragansett warriors.
From Narragansett Bay, they begin a grueling 20-mile overland stealth march back toward the west, aiming to hit the Pequot stronghold at Mystic from the rear, completely by surprise. I am fascinated by the physical and logistical reality of this march. How do you coordinate a stealth movement of nearly 400 men from rival nations, English Puritans, Mohegans, and Narragansetts, across 20 miles of dense, unfamiliar wilderness without alerting Pequot scouts?
The march was an exercise in extreme physical endurance and constant psychological tension. The English militiamen were wearing heavy European armor, including steel corselets, and carrying heavy matchlock muskets, powder flasks, and rations.
We were marching through rough, heavily wooded terrain in the heat of late May.
Right, and the indigenous guides were absolutely crucial for navigation, finding the paths that avoided Pequot patrols.
But the cultural friction within the ranks must have been intense.
The tension was palpable. The Narragansett warriors who traveled light and moved swiftly through the woods were deeply skeptical of the English fighting ability. They viewed the heavily burdened, loud, and slow-moving Puritans as a liability.
Conversely, the English Puritans viewed their indigenous allies with deep religious suspicion and constant paranoia, fearing they would be led into an ambush.
Mason later wrote extensive accounts to justify his command decisions and the entire campaign. He framed this grueling march not just as a military maneuver, but as a holy war.
He claimed the Pequots were organizing a master plan to systematically burn all the English houses and ruin the colonies.
And he convinced his men they were executing a preemptive strike of divine self-defense. Mason imbued his men with a chilling religious zeal. As the combined force approached the Pequot territory, They halted and made camp at a location called Porter's Rocks, just a few miles from the palisaded village of Mystic.
It was the night of May 25th.
From their concealed camp, the English and their allies could actually hear the Pequots inside the fort. The Pequots, still believing the English ships had retreated, were singing and celebrating late into the night.
The quiet buildup at Porter's Rocks is deeply unsettling when you know the violence that is about to unfold. They wait until the celebrations end, and the village falls into a deep sleep.
On the morning of May 26, 1637, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Mason and Underhill silently marched their forces to the edge of the Mystic village.
We need to understand the architecture of Mystic. This was not just a collection of huts. It was a formidable defensive structure.
Mystic was surrounded by a tall, circular wooden palisade. This consisted of thick tree trunks driven deep into the ground side by side, forming a towering wall designed to repel attackers.
Inside the palisade, there were dozens of tightly packed, domed dwellings called wigwams, constructed of wooden frames covered in woven mats and bark.
The English split their forces to surround the fort. Mason approaches the northeast gate, Underhill approaches the southwest gate.
And the Mohegan and Narragansett allies were ordered to form a wide, secondary outer ring surrounding the entire settlement.
The English plan is to breach the narrow gates, enter the fort, and engage in hand-to-hand combat to clear the village. Mason leads a shock group of 20 soldiers right up to the palisade wall.
Suddenly, a dog inside the fort begins to bark frantically. A Pequot sentry spots the armor in the moonlight and yells, "Owanux! Owanux!" which translates to Englishman.
The element of surprise evaporates instantly, but the English are already at the gates.
Mason and his 20 men force their way through the narrow entrance of the palisade. But once inside, the tactical reality of the architecture hits them. The fort is a dense, confusing maze of closely packed wigwams.
The Pequot warriors, though jolted violently awake, grab their weapons and fiercely defend their homes in the dark.
The 20 English soldiers are rapidly overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the chaotic environment.
They are attempting to fire matchlock muskets, but in the dark, confined spaces between the wigwams, the long reload times render the firearms ineffective. They resort to fighting with swords and halberds, but they are losing the advantage. English soldiers begin taking casualties.
Mason realizes his men are going to be slaughtered if they remain trapped inside the maze of the palisade. He is forced to abandon the plan of hand-to-hand combat. He makes a split-second, brutally calculated decision that changes the history of the continent.
Mason decides that military combat is futile. He resorts to total environmental destruction. He enters one of the wigwams, grabs a burning firebrand from the central hearth, and thrusts it into the dry, woven mats of the dwelling.
And the structures, tightly packed and made of dry bark and reed, are highly flammable.
The wind catches the flames, and within moments the fire leaps from structure to structure. The entire village rapidly transforms into a raging inferno.
The fire changes the nature of the attack from a battle to a massacre. Mason and his men retreat outside the palisade and form a firing line surrounding the burning walls.
The conflagration traps the inhabitants inside. The heat and smoke are suffocating.
Anyone who managed to climb over the burning palisade to escape the flames was immediately shot by the English soldiers or struck down by the allied indigenous warriors forming the outer ring.
The scene is apocalyptic. Between 400 and 700 Pequots perished in the fire.
And we must confront the demographics of the victims inside Mystic. The overwhelming majority of the people who burned to death that night were women, children, and elders.
Many of the primary Pequot warriors were either away with Sassacus at the Wineshocks village or out on regional raiding parties.
The sheer scale and indiscriminate lethality of the violence profoundly shocked the Narragansett and Mohegan allies.
This reaction highlights a critical divergence in the cultural rules of engagement. Up to this point in history, indigenous warfare in the Northeast was often highly ritualized.
Right.
The political goals were to exact tribute, avenge a specific wrong through targeted violence, or take captives to integrate into the tribe. Battles were fought to prove military superiority and courage, explicitly avoiding mass casualties.
The objective was domination, not the annihilation of an entire civilian population. but the English brought the European model of total war to the Americas.
They did not view the Pequots as a rival nation to be subjugated. They viewed them as an existential and spiritual enemy to be eradicated.
The Narragansetts and Mohegans were horrified by the massacre. Historical accounts record them crying out in distress as they watched the village burn, yelling at the English that their style of war was too furious and slays too many men.
The indigenous nations had aligned with the English to shift a local political balance, not to participate in the wholesale incineration of hundreds of non-combatants.
The indigenous allies opened a diplomatic door to use the English as a tool against their rivals. But what stepped through that door was a mechanism of violence that fundamentally shattered the established rules of conflict on the continent.
And Mason felt no remorse. He justified the massacre with chilling religious rhetoric. Mason wrote in his official account that God had laughed his enemies to scorn, making the Pequot fort as a fiery oven. And he concluded, "Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen."
He viewed the burning women and children as divine victory. But the violence of May 26 was not over. The sun comes up, Mystic is reduced to ashes, and Mason and his exhausted men are standing deep in hostile territory.
Their ships are anchored in the Thames River, miles away.
And the Pequot warriors from the other major village, Wineshocks, see the immense plume of smoke rising into the morning sky. Hundreds of furious Pequot fighters sprint toward Mystic.
When they arrive and witness the smoldering devastation of their families, they launch a sweeping counterattack against the English and their allies.
What follows is an incredibly grueling military operation known as the English Allied Withdrawal.
For 4.5 miles, the English, who are now burdened with carrying their wounded and wearing heavy armor in the heat, must fight a desperate, continuous running battle to reach their ships.
The Mohegans and Narragansetts, despite their profound horror at the massacre they just witnessed, realize their only chance of survival against the furious Pequot counterattack is to stay close to the English muskets.
They assist by carrying the wounded English soldiers, which frees up the musketeers to form rotating firing lines to hold off the waves of attacking Pequots.
This running battle is fascinating from a modern archaeological perspective. The path of the withdrawal has been extensively studied, and researchers have recovered artifacts that map the exact route of that bloody, exhausting 4.5-mile march.
The battlefield archaeology provides a tangible record of the chaos. Researchers have found drop zones littered with musket balls, shattered arrowheads, and personal items lost in the panic.
They discovered jaw harps, those small metal musical instruments that soldiers clamped in their mouths.
They also found brass arrowheads and pipes that indigenous warriors had ingeniously fashioned from pieces of European trade kettles. Every piece of twisted metal tells the story of that desperate retreat to the river.
Mason and his forces finally reached their ships and escaped. But the devastation at Mystic had irreparably altered the geopolitical landscape. The massacre broke the Pequot ability to defend their homeland.
The physical loss of life was staggering, but the psychological blow was insurmountable. The Pequots realized that their traditional wooden fortifications offered zero protection against this new European method of total warfare.
Remaining in their ancestral territory meant certain annihilation. This grim realization triggers a desperate flight westward. The Pequot nation makes the agonizing decision to abandon their homeland.
The Grand Sachem, Sassacus, gathers the remaining survivors, roughly 400 warriors and their extended families. They destroy their own remaining village at Wineshocks to prevent the English from taking their stores, and they begin a hurried, panicked migration west, attempting to cross the Connecticut River to seek refuge.
And even in retreat, they remain a lethal force. As they cross the river near Saybrook, they encounter 3 Englishmen in a canoe and kill them, proving they are still actively fighting for their survival.
The colonial authorities in Hartford and Boston were not satisfied with displacing the Pequots. By mid-June, John Mason is back on the hunt.
He sets out from Saybrook with a reinforced force of 160 English soldiers and 40 Mohegan scouts led by Uncas.
Their explicit mission is to track down the refugees and eliminate the Pequot leadership. They pursue the fleeing families along the coastline, and they finally corner them in a deep, dense swamp.
This confrontation takes place near the present-day town of Fairfield, Connecticut, in an area then known as Sasqua.
The English forces completely encircle the swamp, establishing a tight siege perimeter. The English send an interpreter, Thomas Stanton, into the swamp to offer terms of surrender.
The English allow the non-combatants, primarily women, children, and the elderly who are exhausted and starving, to surrender. Several hundred individuals walk out of the swamp and give themselves up to the English.
They are immediately taken as prisoners of war. But Sassacus and his core group of fighters refused to surrender to the people who burned Mystic.
Sassacus and about 80 of his most elite, loyal warriors wait deep in the swamp until the darkest hours of the night.
In the pre-dawn fog, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain, they managed to quietly slip through a gap in the English siege lines. They escape the swamp and continue their desperate flight westward.
Where is Sassacus going? He has lost his homeland, his people are captured or dead, and he's being hunted. Who is he trying to reach?
Sassacus is aiming for the territory of the Mohawk Nation, part of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy located in present-day New York. The Mohawks were a formidable military and political power.
Sassacus's strategic goal was likely to seek political asylum, forge a new alliance, and perhaps convince the Mohawks to join him in a combined counterattack to drive the English out of the valley.
It is a desperate geopolitical Hail Mary pass. If Sassacus successfully gets the military weight of the Mohawk Nation on his side, the entire dynamic of the war changes.
The English would face a unified indigenous front, but the Mohawks have their own complex political calculus to consider.
The Mohawk decision is a masterclass in ruthless pragmatism. When Sassacus and his bodyguards arrive in Mohawk territory seeking sanctuary, the Mohawks do not offer them hospitality. Instead, they ambush and execute Sassacus and his entire retinue.
They just murder the Grand Sachem seeking asylum. Why would they do that?
To prove their actions to the English, the Mohawks sever the head and hands of Sassacus and send them via messenger back to the colonial officials in Hartford.
That is incredibly cold-blooded. But we have to dissect the calculated geopolitical survival strategy behind the Mohawk decision. It was not simple betrayal. It was high-level diplomacy.
The Mohawks were closely monitoring the shifting power dynamics of New England. They recognized that a profound shift in regional dominance had just occurred.
The Pequot power structure was entirely broken.
Yes. The English, armed with devastating firepower and now strongly allied with the Mohegans and Narragansetts, were the uncontested military power in the Connecticut Valley.
So if the Mohawks harbored a defeated enemy of the English, they would just be painting a target on their own backs.
Exactly the opposite of what a pragmatic leader would do. The Mohawks decided it was significantly more beneficial for their own long-term survival to appease the heavily armed, victorious English than to harbor a defeated rival with no remaining resources.
By executing Sassacus and sending his body parts as a diplomatic gift, the Mohawks were sending a clear, undeniable message to Hartford.
We recognize your victory, we are not your enemies, and we desire peaceful, lucrative trade relations.
It is geopolitically brilliant, but the sending of the head introduces another grim, enduring element to this conflict, the trophy culture.
The Pequot War formalized a horrific new economy in North America, the commodification of violence through the taking of body parts as battle trophies.
The colonial governments actually established official financial bounties.
They codified it into law. The colonial authorities offered monetary reimbursement and social prestige to anyone, whether an English soldier or an indigenous ally, who brought back the severed heads or scalps of Pequot warriors.
This bounty system financially incentivized the aggressive hunting down of any remaining Pequot survivors long after the major battles were officially over.
With Sassacus dead, the remaining warriors scattered, and the survivors held as prisoners, the military phase of the war is effectively over.
But the English colonists are not finished. They transitioned from military destruction to bureaucratic and legal mechanisms to cement their absolute dominance over the region and the people.
This transition brings us to the formal conclusion of the conflict. On September 21st, 1638, the colonial leaders of Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay, along with Uncas representing the Mohegans and Miantonimo representing the Narragansetts, gathered to sign the Treaty of Hartford.
The Treaty of Hartford is a staggering document to read. It is not a peace treaty negotiated between equals. It is a legally binding treaty of total erasure.
Let us break down the specific terms. What happens to the estimated 200 Pequot prisoners who survived the war and the swamp siege?
The treaty treats the surviving human beings as spoils of war. They are divided up as property. Uncas and the Mohegans are awarded 80 Pequot captives to integrate into their tribe. Miantonimo and the Narragansetts are given another 80.
The remaining captives are distributed to the Eastern Niantics.
They are forced to become subservient members of the tribes that helped destroy them. But the fate of the captives held by the English is even darker.
Many of the Pequot men and boys captured during the war by the English were sold directly into transatlantic chattel slavery.
They were loaded onto ships, notably a vessel named the Desire, and transported to English colonies in Bermuda and the West Indies to endure brutal forced labor on plantations.
The women and girls were often distributed among the English colonial households in Connecticut and Massachusetts as domestic slaves.
So the treaty mandates enslavement and forced assimilation. But the document goes even further in its attempt to systematically destroy the culture itself.
The Treaty of Hartford explicitly outlaws the very name Pequot. It legally dictates that the survivors can never again be referred to by their national identity. They must adopt the name of the Mohegans or Narragansetts who hold them captive.
Furthermore, the treaty strictly forbids any of the survivors from ever returning to inhabit their native land in the Connecticut River Valley, which the English claimed entirely by right of conquest.
They are forbidden from speaking their language, using their name, or stepping foot on their ancestral land. The colonists used the power of legal paperwork to declare an entire nation extinct.
We have a striking physical artifact that visually represents the enforcement of this treaty. It is a piece of diplomatic record-keeping known as the Uncas Wampum Collar.
Describe the visual details of this collar.
It is an intricate collar woven from dark purple and white clam and conch shell beads belonging to the Mohegan sachem, Uncas. Woven into the center of the dark purple beads are two distinct white triangles.
Indigenous scholars and historians interpret those two white triangles as representing the physical division and absorption of the remaining Pequot population into the Mohegan tribe, directly reflecting the terms dictated by the treaty.
It is a piece of diplomatic jewelry that physically records the subjugation of a people.
The concept of bureaucratic erasure is terrifying. Consider how modern legal systems use paperwork, citizenship status, or census categories to erase identity or strip away human rights.
The colonists tried to use the law to make the Pequots disappear from the historical record forever. They declared the Pequot Nation legally extinct in 1638.
But the most significant takeaway from this entire history is that the legal erasure failed.
It spectacularly failed.
Despite the horrific massacres, the transatlantic slavery, the bounty hunting, and the legal outlawing of their very name, the Pequot people survived.
The individuals who were absorbed into the Mohegan and Narragansetts, and the small family groups who managed to hide in the deep woods or escape the region, held fiercely onto their heritage in secret.
They passed down their oral traditions, their history, their language, and their identity through the generations, even when it was illegal and physically dangerous to do so. They maintained the invisible, unbreakable threads of their culture.
And that profound resilience paid off centuries later. The descendants of those hidden survivors eventually organized politically.
The Mashantucket Pequot and the Pawcatuck Eastern Pequot nations successfully fought for and achieved formal federal recognition from the United States government in the late 20th century.
Today, the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation is a sweeping economic and cultural force in Connecticut. They run vast enterprises, including the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, which is entirely dedicated to preserving and teaching the exact history and culture that the colonists tried to burn to ashes and legislate out of existence in 1638.
It is a profound testament to human endurance. The colonial forces won the military engagements of 1637, but they definitively lost the war of historical erasure.
This leaves us with a lot to ponder regarding the legacy of historical memory. For centuries, colonial authorities like John Mason wrote their own self-serving histories to justify their brutal actions.
They controlled the narrative. They had statues erected in their honor, monuments that stood unquestioned in town squares for hundreds of years.
Only recently, after intense historical reevaluation and public protests regarding this dark history, have some of those monuments, like the statue of John Mason in Connecticut, been removed from places of honor or relocated to museums to be studied in their proper critical context.
The true persistence of history does not live in bronze statues or the self-justifying diaries of military commanders. It lives in the people who survived.
The very wampum beads, the physical artifacts, and the oral traditions that the 1638 Treaty of Hartford explicitly tried to eradicate are the exact tools being used today to teach this history to the world.
So as you reflect on the muddy waters of this geopolitical powder keg, ask yourself, when a society attempts to legislate another culture out of existence, what are the subtle, unbreakable threads that allow that culture to survive the fire?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.